When we talk about the league, you got to remember it's 220 member schools, 222 now, I believe, and growing. That's the league. Too often than not, what happens is people talk about the league, and they talk about the 10 people that work in the league office every day and say that's the league. We just work for you. That's what we're there for. We're there, and that staff is there to enforce what the league puts in place consistently. I can promise you, when I started in 2015, one of the first things the commissioner told me, he said, you're going to lose a lot of friends, and you're going to meet a lot of new people. But the one thing we do here is we're going to be consistent in what we do for the fairness to every school in this state. And I can tell you, that's the challenge every day, is to be consistent for everybody in what we do. Because that's our job, to work for you, to be consistent. Now, the problem is on the outside, people say, well, they're not consistent. They did this then, they did this years ago, they do this now. Well, understand, your rules have changed. What you did 20 years ago to get a violation, if you did the same thing today, the rule penalty structure is entirely different. For an example, it used to say if you had an illegal practice in football, if you put pads on when you weren't supposed to, what happened to you? You were out of the playoffs. One day in the spring, out of the playoffs. One day in the summer, inadvertently, out of the playoffs. That was the penalty. Your penalty structure now says it's a little bit different. First time, you're going to lose a day of practice, you're going to pay a fine, lose some scrimmages. So if you try to compare apples to apples from 20 years ago, you're going to miss a lot of time. So understand, our job is to be consistent within what the rules are currently in the league office. So the league itself, again, is the 222 member schools. The person that we reach to at every member school is the principal. That's the voice. Because that's the person that we're going to hear from. When we reach out and ask questions, the principal's the final answer. The AD may be the one we're talking to all the time, but I always tell them, you can write the letter, but make sure your principal signs it. Because that is the head of school we recognize. The only person that we would recognize over that principal would be his or her superintendent. Because they speak for that school from the district. But we're going to take it from the principal at each school. So that is really the head of each member of the South Carolina High School League. Now, who runs the league? The 222 member schools run the league. But we all know that if we had to get 222 to vote on the same thing and be on the same page, it'd never happen. So it's similar to what your government structure is, where you have representation. And that's the executive committee. And right now, Mr. Pearson is performing one of those functions because he's on a personnel and finance subcommittee meeting when the executive committee meets next week to take up financial issues and contractual issues that they'll take into place next week. So he's doing that now because they'll make recommendations to the full committee. The full committee, and pardon me if I miss a number, I believe is 17 people. Could be off one. Am I on, Matt? Yes, sir. And Matt is one of our committee members in a very unique role. He represents State Department of Education. He is appointed by none other than the Superintendent of Education. She has the sole authority. And honestly, Matt's position is the only position that doesn't have a term limit on the executive committee. It is the one position that it can just stay the same person as long as the Superintendent of Education chooses it to be that person. But it's also one of the positions that can change at any minute. Because if she doesn't like what he did, she can take him off tomorrow and put somebody else new on. So who represents you? Well, each class, currently we got 5. Each class has a classification rep. That person is elected by the classification. They do it every year in March when they come to the spring meeting when that term limit is up. This past year, 5A elected a new rep going forward because Mr. Pearson, who is your rep, rolls off with his term. And I believe Ozzie All from Rock Hill was elected to be the new 5A rep. So each class has an opportunity to select their own rep for their term. That rep's job is to represent the class on the executive committee when decisions are made. So there's 5 reps that come directly out of the schools. Then you've got superintendents who have a representation. And that's chosen through SCASA. So the superintendents get a rep. Then you have a principal's rep. So the principals have a rep that they choose through SCASA, through the Principals Association. Department of Education has a rep. We have an officials rep. And they represent the voice of all the officials that are working in the South Carolina High School League. We've got the SCAAA, Athletic Administrators Association. They have a rep that represents the athletic directors. We have a Coaches Association rep that's appointed from your Coaches Association to be a representative to represent coaches on the executive committee. That currently is David Berg from Sherrill High School. So you have, and then we have at-large members. You've got members that represent, the private schools have a rep on there too, and the charter schools have a rep on there. Then we have at-large members. The at-large members are selected or nominated by the president and then approved by the entire body of the executive committee. And those reps are on there to fill out any geographic or gender or race or any type of diversity that we're lacking on that committee. And we now are getting those through SCASA. And what's happened more in the last couple of years is that those have been more superintendents and or principals than before. So when we talk about that room, everybody but 2 people in that room currently on our committee is involved day-to-day in education as their day job. Right now, the only 2, I think Matt from the State Department of Education is not involved day-to-day as his job on education, and then our officials rep is not. But we've had them before where they were. We've had officials reps before who actually work in schools. So you think about that, out of 17 people, 15 of them are involved day-to-day in schools in some capacity. That's what's representing you. That's who runs the league. That's who has the ultimate final decision-making authority. The commissioner's job is to operate the day-to-day procedures of the South Carolina High School League, the day-to-day. If it changes from what the calendar says, what the bylaws say, what the rules and regulations say, any morph of that change has to be approved through the executive committee. For example, in the fall, well, why don't y'all just add a week to football because of the hurricane? That'd be easy. Snap our fingers and add it. We don't have that authority. The commissioner doesn't have that authority because that season schedule is set and the playoffs belong to the executive committee and the membership. The executive committee has to approve that. So it's not as simple as him sitting in the office and making a decision and saying, all right, we're going to do this now. People would like for it to be, but it's not. And that's the democratic process that gives you the fair representation. So when that group gets it, they could say, hey, you know what? Maybe it needs 2 weeks. Maybe we don't need a week. But you understand that group's representing every level of every school we've got, 1 to 5, and every corner of the state we've got, and every entity that it touches. There's not one education entity that we have in this state that involves high school or high school athletics in some capacity that doesn't have a voice on the executive committee. Any questions about anything I've covered so far? So then what happens? How does the information get to them? Well, your classifications are one in themselves. They meet 3 times a year. In the fall, in the wintertime, and they meet again in March. They each elect their own president who runs the class for whatever term limits that class has. Dr. McMillan was the president of 3A when he was a chaplain, and has played a huge role in that classification president. I can tell you, it ain't an easy job as a classification president. In a lot of ways, it can be a tougher job than being on the executive committee, because it's the day-to-day functioning of that class that they're overseeing from the member schools. You want to talk about that role?
Yeah. So, guys, if your principal is not in these conversations, you've got to have that. If your principal's not athletic minded, you're going to have to move them that direction. All right. Go and look at the South Carolina Principal Induction Program and look at how many people fill that room in that program every year. The turnover in our role is unbelievable. Some of you may have a new principal. Some of you may have had the same one for 15 or 20 years, and maybe you're hoping for a new principal. I don't know. But understand that athletics is the front porch to your school. And football, specifically in South Carolina, runs it. I get more calls about athletics than academics any day. I use that line, and I know Jacob Smith in our 5A class, Jacob will say that. I've been able to blend through 2 classifications now, and I've seen everything from the 3A group that always felt like 5A was picking on them, to now the 5A group that's like, hey, we're the biggest, and we've got the most kids, we ought to have some more power. So there's some structure even within that when you're looking at things that happen in our classification meetings. But if you're talking about having a seat at the table, your principal has got to get in the room where these conversations are happening and step up in these classification meetings. Any type of leadership role, a secretary, a treasurer, a vice president, a president, that was very helpful. I unfortunately was leading during COVID, so a lot of our things were virtual. That was really hard to get our group together. I can't say enough about the 3A group of people that we had, and then now in 5A at Spartanburg High School. But the turnover is a real critical factor with new administrators, and they're trying to just survive. And you've got to have a person in leadership that's thriving, particularly because athletics is going to really turn your culture around in your school. And if you don't think it can, you're not in the right place. When you're winning, kids start thinking they can win in the classroom too. They start taking tests a little harder. They start coming to school a lot more, and it can really change your culture. But your principal's got to have a seat at the table to bring those things back to you and your coaching staff. And I'm thankful to have. I had a great athletic director at Chapman High School, and I've hit the lottery with Todd Staley. So I've been super blessed where I've been with just the people around us. But as you're filling out your coaching staff and you have these programs, it's people over programs any day. You've got to have the right people around you, and it starts with us. And it is incredibly difficult. It's an unpaid, thankless position to be a classification president. But it's worth it because our kids are worth it. And this state is too small for bad coaches and bad leadership because we all know each other. I'm looking around this room, and there's people I work with, like D'Angelo, and people that I've spoke to, in schools I've visited, like Coach Marlowe, because as a state principal of the year in 2022, I'm with SCASA as well. So I'm a SCASA principal rep, and we're trying to move SCASA in a direction where there are some athletic and high school league conversations as well too, because we're all in the same boat. We're all in the same body of water, just different sized boats, but we're all trying to get to the same spot. But it is a process where if your principal's not having these conversations saying, hey, what can we do to get a seat at the table, you're going to have to encourage them to say, hey, throw your name in the hat to run for a role. That's where those things happen. And it does take time, but it's important. They've got to carve out the time and be away from the office and go to Columbia and be in those meetings and do that. Put everything aside. The school will be okay. You've got people in place. I'm not sure what's happening at Spartanburg High School today, but I got a great team behind me. If they need me, they'll call me. But this is important that I'm here today. And I thank Mark for the opportunity to be here. Thanks, Mark.
I'm going to step in about the legislative assembly stuff. So I think it's good to know this because when I was assistant football coach at Dormer and I was a head coach at Broome and stuff, I didn't know this structure in the high school league and things. And so not until 12 years ago when I became the AD at Spartanburg did I begin to learn all these different things, and not to say that I know it all. And so not to say that you don't know this, but I think it's worth saying. And so what Charlie's referring to, the executive committee, and what you see up on the screen about changes of rules and regulation, just like we learned in, when we were all in school, the different forms of government and our federal government, stuff like that. You need to know, when you look at the high school league handbook, you got your constitution, you got your bylaws, and then you got your rules and regulations and things like that. What Charlie's referring to is the changes to the rules and regulations when it comes to the executive committee and stuff. But changes to the Constitution and bylaws have to be voted on at the Legislative Assembly every March. And so we all know just what happened 2 weeks ago with the transfer rule and things like that. That had to be approved, and correct me if I'm wrong, it's got to be a 66% or more vote.
I believe so.
Right now is what it is. And so those types of proposals are brought up. They have to be submitted before the end of December, I believe it is, they've brought before each classification meeting, whether it's in January or February, before they are voted on in March. And so this is information that tries to get back to the schools, through the ADs, the principals, and hopefully to the coaches. I know I try to do a great job of communicating to our coaches those things. But down there at that legislative assembly, when these things come to a vote, guys, if you've never been there, if you have, you know what I'm talking about. I mean, you got a row of the 1A regions. You got a row of the 2A regions, the 3A, the 4A, and 5A. And so every region gets a vote. So every school gets a vote in that region, and then the region gets a vote. And so those things don't pass unless it's 66% approval or more. And so that has been the process for the Legislative Assembly for Constitution and bylaw changes. Now, some of you may not know this. There was a committee that met, started 2 years ago, that tried to come up with a proposal to change that it wasn't going to be by classifications. It wasn't going to be a 1A, a 2A, a 3, a 4, a 5. It's going to be by geographics. And so there was going to be an area that was going to include Union County and Spartanburg County and Cherokee County, and you were going to have the 1As through the 5As in that area in one, and it would have changed that whole thing. But when we got down to March of 2024, it got voted down. It didn't get approved, and so we're still where we're at. And so you have a voice in those things as well, through your school, through your region, and they get a vote. And so you get down there, sometimes you don't know how things go. Some of them, it's pretty cut and dry. You know, when a proposal's made to charge the colleges for a high school league pass or something like that, I mean, that's a pretty easy decision. When it came down 2 weeks ago to the transfer rule and stuff like that, I mean, I felt like I was in Columbia on the State House floor. I mean, that's what it felt like, because you got this group goes over here and talks, and this group goes over here and talks, and we're in the 5A meeting on Tuesday afternoon, and we're texting with people in a 4A meeting. Coach knows what I'm talking about, and 3A's texting us. And so there's a lot of talking going back and forth, and wasn't sure exactly what was going to happen, or whether it was going to pass. And people were saying, as it is, it's not going to pass, and so we're going to have to make some adjustments. We're going to have to make some amendments. And that's a process to make an amendment right there on the floor. And so that amendment to not ban senior transfers from the playoffs was the first thing that was coming up. Well, more people will support this if that comes up. I'll be honest with you. I don't want to say amendment, the proviso, so to speak, on this thing about giving the seniors in the 26 class that one time, man, that came out of wildfire. I mean, that was not even discussed in the 5A meeting on Tuesday afternoon, and we got a vote on Wednesday morning, and it wasn't until Tuesday night, Wednesday morning before that this thing just spread like wildfire. Did I think it was a good thing? Yeah, I do. I think it was good because these kids weren't going to get that opportunity. But I wanted to share with that because there is a legislative assembly. That's where your constitutional bylaw changes are made. And then, as Charlie spoke to the executive committee, is where, you know, in the 5A thing, and I'm sure all classifications, we were taking straw votes on the four-quarter thing. We're taking straw votes on do you move up the start of practice by a day just because of the weekends and things like that. We took straw votes on what they want to consider about playoff basketball for semifinals. Do we want to try to move them back to upper state and lower state? Do we still want to try to stay in one spot? Straw votes on whether lacrosse should be able to put pads on in open season in the fall. So all schools had their own vote. They all got a QR code. They could go on there and put their vote. So that information is what's being shared back to the executive committee. Dr. Pearson, he can share that with each member of that committee, and then they can make decisions based on those things. And so that's another place where you've got to make sure you're getting a voice through your AD, through your principal in those straw votes.
And if you notice, in everything Coach Staley just said, nothing involved league staff making a change or decision on. All we're there is to help answer questions that come up for the what-ifs. And there's still things with the transfer rule that was passed that even in our office, we're saying, what if? Trying to sort it out, which is why we haven't published anything formally about it to the membership yet, because there's still some what ifs, and we know as soon as we publish, we're going to get a ton of questions, and if we're not ready for some of those answers, then we're getting our skis out in front of us too far. So that's the process for changing your bylaws and your constitution. The beauty of it is that conference is every year in March, which means every year you can change every bylaw. So if you change it and it don't work, you can change it again next year and operate the following year entirely different. If there's something in there that you just say, this has got to be changed, tell your principal or superintendent, let's write a proposal and get it in by January 1, and let's try to get it changed.
And touch back on that, Charlie, it has to come from the principal or the superintendent. It
Correct.
can't come from AD, it can't
Correct.
come from a coach.
Correct. Which means you need them to be on board with you if you believe it needs to be changed. And it's probably a good idea that they have some conversation with other schools to see if it makes sense to them. Because the one thing sometimes we do, and we're all guilty of it in our own worlds, is we see things from our own 2 feet and our own vision. We don't see it from the top down and how it impacts a lot of other folks too. Because sometimes 5A is like, yeah, that's a great rule. And the smaller classes are like, no, that would absolutely just crush us. Sometimes those schools say, that would be awesome. And 5A and them are like, no, that don't work. So that's the beauty of it. It's that all the classes have the ability down there to make that decision. And then we talk about changes to the rules and regulations. Some of those are going to take place next week at activities meeting next Monday to go over. I think we've got 13 proposals currently for activities. This is the one time that the league staff can propose stuff, but it's just like a school. School proposes it. Auxiliary association proposes it. League staff proposes it. But I can tell you everything on there the league staff's going to propose, they talked about either in January or in March and got a straw poll to give back to their classification. So that process up there is how it works. What you do is you get a proposal. It comes from a school, or it comes from an auxiliary association, or it can come from league staff. You send that proposal in. Usually it comes to me. Some people send it to the commissioner, he sends it to me. I then compile everything. If there's questions on it for what you're trying to do, or if it's not clear, or the wording's wrong, sometimes we'll have people write, change to the practice rules for fall practice season. Well, we don't have the language fall practice season. Are you referring to the open season? Yes. Okay. So that would just make sure we're on the same page. Because we like to take the language you put in there and then copy and paste it into the rules and regulations. So then we get that, and then it's imperative that the author or the authors get feedback. We've had a lot of proposals that get sent in for activities, and so you got feedback. No, I just think this would be good. Well, I can tell you 9 out of 10 times, unless it is an extreme health or safety situation, if you don't have any feedback from the membership, the executive committee won't touch it. They won't touch it, because they're not going to vote on what they think it ought to be. Usually they'll table it out of consideration and give you a chance to come back and get feedback. But if there was zero feedback on it, it's really hard for them to make an informed decision on behalf of the member schools at that committee to determine whether they need to approve it or not. If it has a health and safety component to it, we then take it to our sports medicine advisory group just to get their feedback. And the misnomer there is that they're going to approve it or deny it. That group never takes a vote. That group of folks sits there and they talk about it and they give their medical opinion and how it impacts it medically. If it makes medical sense. If there's medical data to support what we've got. We've had some before that says, oh, they need a break because if they play too much, injuries increase. And our medical people says, look at that sport. There's no data that supports what they just said. That's not accurate. So that's what they're there for. Then we take that back to the executive committee. And I think there's a process here in a minute. We can talk about what that group does and how it works. But listen, just because that group says no, it doesn't have medical support, doesn't mean the executive committee is going to say no. They can say yes. They just know they're saying yes, knowing that there's not medical support for what they're about to do. For example, the 11v11. That didn't have support from the medical side of it. It didn't have, they weren't totally against it. But their theory on it was that, well, you know what? We're inviting an opportunity for contact where it currently doesn't exist. That's their concern from a medical standpoint. No data supports it either way. But you're opening up an opportunity for contact where we don't have it now, especially when we don't have pads. That was their feedback. The executive committee said, we think our schools can handle it, and passed it. So there's an example of where they weren't necessarily 100% in favor, and the executive committee made an educated decision on behalf of you. Activities then gets it. I take it to the subcommittee, and the activity subcommittee is made up of members of the executive committee, and they will take it and they will make a recommendation. Activities can't kill it and they can't pass it. They just make a recommendation. So then the recommendations come to the full committee. So that's what Mr. Pearson's doing now, Personnel and Finance, is they're going to take up issues and make recommendations. On Monday, we'll have a Zoom call for activities, and they'll make recommendations. Just because they recommend it doesn't mean the committee's going to pass it. Just because they don't recommend it doesn't mean the committee won't pass it. It's just a starting point.
What are the different subcommittees in the executive committee?
We have personnel and finance, we got activities, and then we have the legislative subcommittee. And the legislative subcommittee's job is to go through all the legislative proposals that Coach Staley just talked about when we vote in March, and they make a recommendation if the committee would support it or not. And all that is just saying if the league passes this, they would be in line with what the executive committee's thinking. But again, just because they support it doesn't mean the membership's going to say, great idea.
When we get those proposal stuff on a sheet, we see at the bottom whether the executive committee said recommended or not recommended. Sometimes the membership goes along with it, sometimes they don't.
And other subcommittees, like I know one was working on like playoffs and things like that.
Playoff subcommittees?
Yeah, different subcommittees.
So your playoffs and how your playoff structure is decided by the class. Executive committee has the authority over the playoffs, but what they've done in the most modern recent history, in my time there, and our commissioner now believes those things belong to the classifications because it impacts those schools. And who knows better than what they want than those classifications. Now, y'all came out and said, hey, 58 of us are going to make it, and we're all going to play twice and get beat twice in football. Executive committee going to come in and say, listen, that's not happening. What they're going to do is set the dates. Here's the dates, when it starts and when it ends. Y'all make it work. Say, look, this is how you're going to play it, and you follow the parameters of the sport. So that's why you see some classes have the RPI, for lack of a better term, system, and some just have how you qualify out of the region. Sometimes people get mad and say, well, the H's didn't get flipped. I've gone to them 3 years in a row in the 4th round every single time. This isn't fair. The high school league's getting me. Well, you need to talk to your classification because that's where it runs through. Each classification has a bracket committee, and that's made up of a representative, again, here from every region who sits on that committee and who determines what the playoff bracket should look like. Now, the beauty of that is that should be done now for next year. When we have realignment, that's usually done by the end of June for the next year. Right, so you come out to spring meetings, I guarantee you almost every classification knows what their brackets are going to be next year. Now, they haven't put them down and gotten them to us, and we haven't published them yet, but they know it. And there's the best part of that. All those decisions are made before anybody knows who's going to finish first, second, third, or fourth in a region, who's going to win the first, second, third, or fourth round. All that's decided right there. So when you look at it and say, man, we had to go to them 3 times in a row in the 3rd round, and we both have been the same seed every single time. That should have been called before a game was ever played. But we don't catch it until we get to the week of and say, this isn't fair to our kids. That's where Dr. McMillan's saying, you got to have people that are there, that communicate back with you. And honestly, when our brackets get published, that's when as a coach, you got to comb through those things and say, hey, I got a question on this. And you go to your AD and your principal and say, hey, is this right? Does this make sense? So that's the beauty. Most 99% of our decisions, actually 99.9, are all made before names and faces are attached. Because what happens is when you start making decisions when names and faces are attached, now emotions get involved. And now you start pulling at heartstrings, and woe is me on the kids and our school, and we're on the bad end of everything. So if the decision's made when we don't know how it's going to impact anybody, like the rules and regulations, like the bylaws, we don't know who's going to have it ineligible with the transfer rule right now. You know what the rule's going to be. But when it impacts you next year, you can't say, well, I don't like this now. Well, we knew what the rule was before it impacted that kid or impacted you. So that's the beauty of your organization. On top of the fact, you don't like a rule and regulation, we can change it next year.
Yes, sir.
Paige Walford, Northwestern High School. I'm just going on some of the questions here. Who does the commissioner report to?
Executive committee.
So does the commissioner have a boss?
Executive committee. Collective.
So if the executive committee didn't like what the commissioners do, they could remove him from that position.
Collectively, yes.
What is collectively?
When they meet, when they have a formal meeting, yes. They can't in the groups of 5 or 6 get together and decide they're going to have a meeting. They're going to have what's called a quorum, which means it is a valid meeting by Robert's Rules of Order and all that good stuff. But yes, they would have to have that collective meeting.
How are executive committee members chosen?
Well, it depends.
Are they all voted for, or?
Well, the 5 class reps are voted for through the classifications. The SCAAA, which is the Athletic Administrators Association, their board selects their rep, who they want it to be. Coaches Association, they select their board selects, or their executive director appoints. I'm not sure how they do that, but they have their processes. SCASA, the superintendents, they select amongst themselves who they want to be their rep. The principals is the same way. The State Department of Education, of course, the superintendent of education appoints that person. Officials, they all get a vote for who their rep's going to be. The at-large members, the private school, charter school reps, when their terms expire, I believe that falls to the current president at that time to make a recommendation. But given the number of those schools, they try to bounce them around amongst those schools and to get that person on there. And then the at-larges come from recommendations from SCASA, and then the president has the ability to offer the appointment to the body.
How much input does the commissioner have on who gets chosen in the executive committee?
I would say very little to none.
Very little to none.
To my knowledge, yes. To my knowledge, yes.
Coach, I can tell you from a 5A classification, you know, we knew Dr. Pearson was, his term's running out, and so we knew down there 2 weeks ago that in our 5A meeting on Tuesday, we're gonna have to elect somebody to be the 5A. And so nominations were taken, you know, what discussions were had before that, but, you know, Ozzie Hall's name was nominated, it was accepted, nobody else, you know, was nominated, and a vote was taken, and of course, he's been the executive,
Sure, yeah.
you know, on the committee several times, so I can tell you from a 5A perspective, you know, they're not even there, you know.
Yeah, the commissioner, usually his role is to notify the class or the entity that they need a new rep and that he needs a name when they have the rep. And that's always changing because, you know, if Rock Hill slides down to 4A in the next realignment, Ozzie Hall will have 1 year as a 5A rep, and they'll have a new rep in 5A they'll have to vote for. So as classifications change and principles change, my daughter McMillan, who was a 3A president, when he moved to Spartanburg, he couldn't be a 3A president anymore. And then some of those have qualifications to them, to where if you're not, if you don't meet those qualifications anymore, for example, you move out of the school to a district office, if it doesn't quantify and the description of that position, you can't serve in that any longer.
So does the commissioner, he's not on term, he just rehired every year, or? he's just hired-
I'd have to let Mr. Pearson speak to that. I don't know how the contractual stuff works. I know what my paycheck says every month, and outside of that, I don't know what anybody else's terms are. Yeah. Yes, sir.
John Roscoe, how many executive board members are here today?
2, I believe. Mr. Ayers back there in the back, and then Mr. Pearson is in another meeting right now. Mr. Pearson is your current president, and that changed 2 years ago. Yeah, it used to be that the president was elected by the classification when their spot came up. So it became a revolving door. You know, it'd go 5 to 4 to 3 to 2 to 1. So each president would get a 1-year term, and he would be elected by that class to be the president. And then he would come in as the vice president for a year, or she would, then be the president, and then become the past president. And that was a 1-year term in each. And then what changed was they decided they wanted it to be a 2-year term. So you'd be a president for 2 years. Because reality, you need that person to be there for 2 years, because when you get it for the first year, it's a whirlwind, and by the time you figure it out, it's the last meeting, and you're like, if I had known all this when we started, it would have been a much smoother year for the whole committee. Well, now what's changed, I think the membership changed it 2 years ago, if I'm not mistaken, to where the classes aren't electing an outside president. Because what was happening is, if it was 3A's term, they'd have a 3A rep and the president. So they had 2 people on there, essentially. So what's changed is that the president now is elected from inside the executive committee. So that committee will select who the next president will be next year. And I think the qualifications of that are they have to have been on the committee for at least 2 years to ensure that they have some working knowledge of how the committee works. And then that group will make a nomination, and they'll elect who the next president will be next year going forward. And they'll do that probably next week, would be my guess.
One other quick question. I'm very fortunate with my administration. They keep us in the know in the past. Prior to Dr. McMillan, I was working with some who may not have kept us in the know. And would the league consider putting some of these things actually on the website, like proposals, drawings, poll results, whatever subcommittees, executive committees are on, in case we, take upon ourselves to be educated?
That would be a commissioner question, and those are things that he wants to put out there. I can tell you that every committee that we have that is formed either outside the executive committee, for example, the realignment committee, we had the committee that looked at the transfer rule this past year. All those names and where they work were published and sent to the member schools and documentation. Here's who your representative is on that. When we have all the proposals that come to the legislative assembly, those are all sent out well in advance. I mean, if an AD or principal said they didn't get it, I don't know what to tell you about that. But as we see with some stuff, and I think both Coach Staley and Dr. McMillan would tell you when we had our opportunity to speak at the legislative assembly, one of the things I spoke about was communication. We've got to share communication down with those in our buildings. And we have some who do a fantastic job of that, and we have some that they don't. Don't know why. The answer is they don't. Maybe they do, and the people don't read it. But the opportunity's there when your principal and AD gets it. I would encourage you all to say, hey, if y'all get anything from the league, could you just send it to me? I'd like to read it, see it, hear it myself. That's the best way to do it, to be honest with you. And we've gotten, I will say we're probably way more transparent today than we were when I first started. And the commissioner has made a very, I don't know how to say it, he's very clear that he wants it to be more transparent than it was and to continue to evolve, which is why you go to our Rewind tab. All of our executive committee meetings are live now on stream. You can't hide in the boardroom anymore and not have anybody hear what's said. So they're all open to the public to be able to watch everything that's said. And the cameras are good enough now. When they start talking, the camera finds them, so you know exactly who it is talking. So it's becoming it's increasingly transparent as we go and continuing to try to evolve in that transparency.
How are the committee members chosen? You've not named 3 main committees. How are those members chosen?
The president of the executive committee, he makes a decision on how to divide those folks up.
So the one guy chooses the members of all 3 of those committees?
As I think that's where the continuity of leadership, Coach, and challenging your people in your building. There are leadership roles everywhere. Charlie mentioned, guys, just the bracket committee. Like you guys know, going back to your schools, what's going to cause you the biggest heartburn is a playoff issue or an ineligibility issue or something that could be avoided. So, and a lot of these guys, there's not new people coming out of teacher prep programs, guys. So we're all facing a shortage. We all know that one person, like when I was in 3A, I was going to call Mike Morris at Woodruff because he was the bracket guy. I was going to call Tim Sheriff at West Oak because he was the wrestling guy. Everybody has that. Guys, they're not making more of these people. So if there's an opportunity for you and you're interested in this, that's a great place for you to plug in right there. I remember when we left in the classification meetings, we had the 32-team bracket. It was in hard copy form. I remember Coach Rent put out one meeting. He was like, "Hey man, you got the brackets?" "Yes, I do, right here." Where's that home seed? Where's that flip? You know, as you might be thinking about your individual team and where it's coming, but there are opportunities there. But you've got to have some name recognition or somebody, you know, with their name somewhere in a room that you're not to say, "Hey, I'd like Paige Walford to be a part of this," whatever it may be. You're thinking about running your teams, but you've got to put that AD and principal out there to have those opportunities. I was on that geographic committee where SCASA, we looked at what SCASA was doing with regions to then do our vote that way, and it got voted down. I spent a lot of time on that committee, and I'm not sour about that. It was a great opportunity. But it got voted down because that's the process. You know, so it's just, there's going to be some trial and error. And if your people want a seat at the table, you've got to put themselves out there. We are the league. we do make up the league. I know it's a broken record, and Charlie started off by saying that. Like, I know that's the biggest rub, because I hear it. Oh, it's the league, we can't do anything about it. Guys, we make up the league. If we're sitting there, our silence cannot be indifference. We have to speak up and come together and put people in the right position to make these changes, if we think there's a change needed. But you can't sit there and say, oh, my school doesn't get considered or whatnot. Maybe your people aren't doing enough. They got to build some capacity within themselves to do that. If your superintendent gets 1 million emails a day, which they do, like Charlie said, tell them, hey, if you get something, please send it to me. Our superintendent will forward stuff as soon as he gets it. And we're already copied on the email. We've already gotten it. And he knows that. But he still does it. And we talk about continuity, there's probably 8 superintendent jobs open right now in the state. That is a challenge. They're not making new superintendents. They're going to pull a principal up, they're going to pull a district office person up. They're trying to survive. So there's a lot of issues we have right now with continuity and leadership. And some of your guys are aging out, and they've done this one thing forever. Somebody else is going to pick up the torch. And be ready to get in there and do something. That's why I like this smaller environment here, because y'all know those classification meetings can go sideways real quick. This school don't like this school thought they stole my best player, yada, yada, all these sidebar conversations. We got to be able to, in this group together in this room, be able to talk and put some things forward.
And just to kind of bounce off that a little bit, as organized as Coach Remp and Dr. McMillan were, Dr. McMillan could tell you that he still fielded questions and controversies related to the brackets as the president. Even though they were organized and had it all mapped out, people still challenged him. And that's okay, because, you know, they have questions on behalf of their school. But usually it's coaches that didn't pay attention to it till the very end. And Coach Fiddler's nodding his head because he's head of the brackets on 4A. And he'll tell you, they don't pay attention until they get through the district round of softball or baseball, and it's like, wait a minute, why are we going to them? We're undefeated, and they're the second team in their region. Man, this has been published for 9 months. Where have you been looking? So that's the challenges to it. And listen, it's part of being in that leadership role. You got to hear those complaints and those challenges and deal with it. The other piece I'd share, and I'm not under a rock all the time, but we hear a lot, the league just continues to make dumb decisions. Listen, the decisions that are made at our office are in line with what you have written to follow. It's not a dumb decision by one person. It's what's in line with what the membership has put in place to follow. All we're doing is applying what it is. And people just, and a lot of times, what's on the outside isn't all the facts that are on the inside. What gets put out there isn't always the whole truth. They give you just enough of the truth to help you see their opinion of it. But when you get the collective truth, your opinion of it would probably change. But in fairness, we don't embarrass people that way at the league. In fact, there was a member school 2 or 3 years ago that said they wanted every violation and every rule that was penalized. It should be published with the school's name and the penalty to it. And I don't remember what the vote was, but it wasn't close to 66% to pass it. It was probably more like the 4%. But the membership has said, we don't want that public. We don't want that public embarrassment. And I can tell you, just because it doesn't go to the executive committee doesn't mean it didn't happen. A lot of times what you see in the press, and a lot of times what you see when it hits the executive committee, that's just one. We've had numerous ineligibles that did not appeal. We've had numerous major violations that did not appeal. Administration of the school said, we understand, we don't like it, but we accept it because that's what was written and you applied it the way it should have been applied. And we take that. Not saying that's right, not saying that's wrong, but just because it doesn't make it public doesn't mean it happened. So a lot of times people think, well, boy, I can't believe they did this to this school. What you don't know is it may have happened to 6 others. The other 6 didn't push it. The other 6 said, we see where it says it, we're good.
Coach Shaw, you have a question?
Yeah, I appreciate the transparency. You guys have done a great job. The information's out there. But you do have to be proactive and assertive. But to be transparent with speaking as a coach, I feel like there's a perception that there's not enough coaches' representation on the executive committee. I don't know if there's an answer to that, whether it's right, wrong, or different, but it's a perception. Is there a way to increase coaches' representation on the executive committee?
Well, you'd have to change the bylaws. It talks about who consists of the executive committee and who makes up the membership of it. But, you know, it depends on the year and how it flows out. I mean, you could have, like the 1A classification rep, Kobe Bradenberg, he is still a coach. He's also the athletic director, but he is still a coach. Now he's a basketball coach, but he is still a coach. You know, David Byrd, you know, he coaches football, he coaches baseball, and he's an AD. So you could argue the ADs have too many reps on the committee to some degree. But then you have a lot of former principals who have coached as well, or principals on there who have coached, and then superintendents who have coached in some capacities there. So while they may not be in a position that says coach today, they have a history of leadership and coaching in various sports too on there too. So sometimes you got to peel the layer back a little bit and see, okay, yep, she's a superintendent, she was a principal, but she also was a coach at one point early in her career and a classroom teacher. So it's a little more, you got a little more representation than what the surface shows.
The last thing I will say is I would love to connect with your principal if they have questions. One of the things your classification president has to do, which is a principal, is preside over your realignment meetings in January. And that's a lot of appeals, a lot of hard feelings, and that's an interesting process. I had to go through that twice because I overlapped after a person took over, and then I ran a 2-year term. So I saw an end of alignment in a 2-year alignment, realignment. So that's something also that person would need to be prepared for. But again, I would love to, if they have questions, you know, I'd love to talk with them and just help them. Because again, the state is really small. Like, we're all gonna, you know, be impacted by these kind of things. And if I could help your principal, I'm probably gonna learn something from them too. So that's just one other thing. If they're interested in doing that, that is gonna come up, as I think we are in a realignment year coming up here soon. So
I think too, and I'm speaking just because we got football coaches here, the Football Coach Association is representative of 1 through 5A. And so there's a lot of different avenues for your voice to be heard, whether it's through your AD, your principal, things like that. But, you know, and I can't speak for 1A through 4A because I'm just in 5A, but, you know, when we're talking about committees, there's a football committee of the 5A, there's a golf committee of the 5A, there's a lacrosse committee of the 5A, and everything, the bracket committee, there's a constitutional bylaws committee, and every one of those committees has a representative from every region. And so one thing, you need to make sure you know who your region rep is on the football committee for your classification, so that your voice can be heard through that avenue, it can be heard through your principal. And so I think one is understanding all the complexity of, you know, I can speak through this group, I can speak through this group, and sometimes I think because you're representative of all 5 classifications, something in 2A might not be communicated the same way in the 5A football committee. And so you being unified has a lot to do with it. Now, whether that's 51% of you or 75% of you, I don't know. But you got to be unified as well.